All right, we're going to get started this semester and jump right into chapter 19. So chapter 19, we start here for several different reasons, but this chapter goes over the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. These two are kind of major turning points in human history because we see these huge shifts in the way of thinking starting to happen. So, for instance, no longer do humans think that we are the center of the world, of the universe, and that everything revolves around us. We actually learn that, no, our planet revolves around the sun. Kind of in how we fit in with nature and how we're connected to nature and how when we manipulate things in nature or even in science or medicine, how that can benefit or even hurt us with these two major new ways of thinking and applying the rational world, if you will. So this chapter, it starts off with the scientific revolution. It talks about important changes in scientific thinking and practice. We're then going to move on to the rise and spread of the Enlightenment, then key issues of the Enlightenment debate, and we'll end with economic change in the Atlantic world. So think about the Atlantic Ocean, right? That's Europe, Africa, the Americas. There we go. So we start off and we really talk about the Muslim contribution and multiple centers of scientific, mathematical, technological achievement existed around the globe in 1500. But during this time, Islamic lands were a center of scientific activity. So between the year 750 and 950, Muslim scholars began translating and continuing the legacy of ancient Greek learning. This period of prosperity gave rise to a cultural flourishing called the Golden Age of Islam. Muslim scholars and centers of learning such as Cordoba and Baghdad established the world's first institutions of higher learning, so like our first universities, if you will. They also established libraries and developed algebra, the concept of the algorithm, and the decimal point system. The re-establishment of stronger monarchies and growth of trade in the High Middle Ages contributed to a renewal of learning in Western Europe. And continuing with the Muslim contribution, contacts with Islamic civilization brought the works of ancient Greece as well as advancements made by Muslim scholars to Europe. The Renaissance gave a foundation for the scientific revolution. There was great emphasis on the value of classical education for creating a virtuous and civic-minded elite. We follow that model. We actually adhere more to a German model that was brought over, kind of developed a little bit later, but we follow that model. Like, you're probably wondering, I know most of you in this class are history majors, but why do I have to take algebra? I'm never going to use math in history. Not true. You will probably use like statistics at some point, but it's supposed to make you a more rounded and a better person and a better citizen, if you will. Remember, that was also from the ancient Greeks, this idea of citizen and rule of the people by the people. But it's supposed to make you kind of more aware of what's going on around you in the world and knowing what was good for civilizations and what was bad for civilizations, having that more rounded education. So European universities established professorships of mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Don't worry, history we have our place later on. So let's talk for a minute about scientific thought up to the year 1550. And there's this desire to understand the world, and it really focused on the nature of the universe. Its purpose and function developed into the discipline of natural philosophy. This led to what is identified as modern science. Initial stages of natural philosophy were based on the classical thoughts of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Translations of Arabic texts into Latin brought awareness of subjects including math and astronomy. Arabic and Persian mathematics had invented algebra, the algorithm, and the decimal point notation. And just FYI, we use Arabic numerals. So this is actually Arabic for 1, Arabic for 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's kind of cool. Like, we borrowed the way that they write numbers. We borrowed that system. Explorations increased geographical knowledge and forced inventors to create navigational tools to assist the explorers. Other inventions included the telescope, the barometer, thermometer, microscope, and just a litany of others. Nicholas Copernicus was the first to depart from the medieval understanding of the physical world system. He studied astronomy, medicine, and church law at major universities, including the one in Bologna. Copernican hypothesis presented a revolutionary view of the universe, which infuriated Protestants who objected to his thoughts that the earth moved and the sun did not. Right? So that old belief that the sun revolved around the earth. Now we know that the earth revolves around the sun. Both Calvin and Luther, John Calvin and Martin Luther, condemned Copernicus. At first, the Catholic reaction was mild, but later the Catholic Church called the hypothesis false. Tycho Brahe, he was a Danish astronomer. He worked in an observatory in Prague where he planned new tables of planetary motions. His sudden death prevented the completion of his work, though, but he is going on to kind of continue the work of Copernicus. Johann Kepler, Brahe's assistant, continued to rework his data. He developed three revolutionary laws of planetary motion. The first revolutionary law was that the orbits of planets around the sun were elliptical, not circular. The second law of Kepler was that the planets did not orbit at uniform speed. And finally, Kepler identified that the time a planet took to make a complete orbit was related to its distance from the sun. Galileo Galilei challenged the ideas of motion. He formulated the law that confirmed motion was the natural state of an object. He stated that the object is naturally in motion until another external force stops its movement. This was identified as the law of inertia. Kepler and Galileo discussed Copernicus' studies with each other through letters and agreed that the Copernican hypothesis was actually accurate. Yet support for the hypothesis was dangerous because of the church's disagreement. You have to keep in mind the church is kind of the law. They are even sometimes above the law. So you don't really go and challenge the church. And if you did, you were seen as a heretic and you could still die. You know, if the church condemned you to death, that was not a big deal during this time. Just to give you an idea, here's Galileo's telescope and his drawn, obviously his illustrations of the moon. So what about Isaac Newton? He was born into a family of lower English gentry, and he enrolled at Cambridge University, and he ended up studying physics. He combined the studies of Copernicus, Kepler, and the physics of Galileo, and developed the law of universal gravitation. The law of universal gravitation held that objects are attracted to each other, and the force of attraction is proportional to the quantity of matter the object contains and the distance between the two objects. In other words, you throw something up, it's going to be gravitated, it's going to attract to the earth, and it's going to fall back down. Over in Spain, because of its large overseas empire, they led the way in studying geography and cartography, drawing of maps, and the new plants, animals, and minerals of its global empire. In the 1560s, Francisco Hernandez gathered information on thousands of new plants and their characteristics, bringing Mesoamerican botanical knowledge to Europe. Other European countries followed Spain's lead. In 18th century, Swedish scientist Linnaeus used observations and specimens collected from around the world to develop a classification system for living organisms that we still use today. Centuries-old practices of magic, alchemy, and astrology remained important to the new natural philosophers. Belief in hidden connections between materials pushed natural philosophers to search for these occult connections. Johann Kepler remained committed to astrology and explained his discoveries on planetary motion in terms of music and harmony, kind of keeping with that old tradition. Francis Bacon formalized the empirical method of research, though, and the empirical method was inductive reasoning, demanding evidence through observation and experimentation rather than reason and speculation. Descartes understood a relationship between geometry and algebra, and this meant that the geometrical figures could be presented as algebraic equations. His discovery of analytic geometry became a useful scientific tool in research. Descartes' greatest achievement was Cartesian dualism, an idea which argued that all of reality could be reduced to mind and matter. While Bacon established inductive reasoning, Descartes established deductive reasoning, and they were combined to create the modern scientific method of research. Paracelsus was a Swiss physician and alchemist. He pioneered the use of chemicals and drugs to address chemical imbalances. Then we have Andreas Vesalius, he studied anatomy by dissecting human bodies. His work entitled On the Structure of the Human Body included hundreds of drawings of the human anatomy. English physician William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood through veins and arteries and explained the workings of the heart. Robert Boyle discovered the basic elements of nature, and he created a vacuum and identified that the pressure of gas varied with volume. Isn't all this stuff so cool? If you're really into science, this is some really cool stuff. If you're not into science, this is kind of the boring part of the scientific revolution, but I promise it'll get better. And during the scientific revolution, most practitioners were devoutly religious. Heliocentrism, however, threatened the understanding of mankind's place in the creation as taught in the Old Testament. So in 1616, the Holy Office placed the works of Copernicus and others, such as Kepler, on a list of books forbidden for Catholics to read. In 1633, Galileo was tried for heresy for openly defending the ideas of Copernicus. These studies over a number of years created the social group of the international scientific community. Governments intervened to support and direct research, creating close ties with the state and the state's agenda. National academics of science were established under state control. Women were accepted in some academic circles, but many academies that provided professional degrees did not accept female members. All religions popular in the West continued to oppose the Copernican system. States that were not anchored in religious authority became pro-science states. So, and kind of at the same time that we have the scientific revolution happening, we also have the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, this was an intellectual and cultural movement that introduced new thought based on those scientific methods and also on reason. The view identified as skepticism was developed by Pierre Bayle, a French Huguenot. He evaluated religious beliefs and persecutions and argued that nothing could ever actually be known beyond all doubt. There was an element of skepticism in all belief. Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish faith when he argued that the identity of God and nature were two names for the same thing. One of the most influential Enlightened thoughts was developed by John Locke. His work, Essay Concerning Human Understanding, explained how humans learn and form their own ideas. The intellectual groups who brought knowledge to others were identified as philosophers. They wrote novels, plays, dictionaries, and encyclopedias filled with satire and presented double meanings to inspire critical thinking. You've probably heard of Montesquieu. He wrote the Persian Letters, a social satire that presented a view of European society from a foreign perspective. He also wrote The Spirit of Law, which was a critical view of royal absolutism. Voltaire was a reformer in social and political matters, and he believed the best form of government was a good monarchy and that human beings were rarely able to govern themselves. The philosophers criticized religious intolerance, which only led to savage, inhuman action. The greatest achievement of theirs was the 17-volume encyclopedia, the Rational Dictionary of the Sciences, the Arts, and the Crafts. So, Scottish Enlightenment figures included David Hume, who argued that the human mind was nothing but a collection of impressions. Adam Smith, he was also Scottish. He wrote the classic Inquiry into Nature and the Causes of Wealth of Nations. Smith was an advocate for economic liberalism. Then we have an East Prussian professor, you probably heard of him, Immanuel Kant, argued that serious thinkers needed the freedom to exercise their thoughts publicly in print, so enlightenment could continue to spread throughout the population. Yet he insisted that the people must obey laws, even if the law was unreasonable. Kant introduced a new strain of philosophy called German idealism, which identified a gap between reality and one's perception of reality. However, he argued that humans had a shared framework for understanding perception that did correspond to empirical reality. Beccaria was an important Northern Italian advocate for penal reform. So like jail and prison reform. He was opposed to capital punishment and torture and advocated prevention over punishment in his 1764 work on crimes and punishment. Have you guys noticed some of these names are appearing both in the scientific revolution and with the Enlightenment, right? It's kind of interesting. So kind of like this philosophical debate that's based on science. Among educated Europeans, a new awareness of global cultures possessing different beliefs and customs led many to embrace a relativistic view on truth and morality. Some philosophers revered Chinese Confucianism, for example, as a natural religion of morality, discovered by reason. Others rejected China kind of as an outcast. Europeans debated Islamic culture as well and were divided in their opinions. The cultures of the New World led many Europeans to question acceptable values. Rousseau and others saw the peoples of the America as living examples of the natural man uncorrupted by civilization and society. And now we're going to get into these new definitions of race. So as the variety of peoples interacted with each other, new ideas of race as a classification emerged. Scientists who had developed classifications of plants and animals now began to classify human beings through empirical observation. Race was used as a biological term to designate separate groups rather than the cultural historical designation of nations. Some Enlightenment figures criticized biological classifications of superiority and inferiority, but most accepted these new classifications as scientifically sound. We all know that we don't consider any race superior and another inferior. We've kind of gotten rid of that old school idea of thinking. So what about women's place in the Enlightenment? Women's role in society and gender differences fascinated Enlightenment thinkers. Early Enlightenment women, they made crucial contributions to debates about women's rights and to broader Enlightenment discussions. You also have very wealthy women. They met in fancy drawing rooms called salons where they discussed literature, science, and philosophy. Later Enlightenment figures such as Rousseau put greater emphasis on nature over tradition, claiming women's characteristics were determined by reproductive function. This was a parallel to the growth in belief in racial determinism. Prussia's most fundamental reform was the legal system that simplified Prussian law. Torture of prisoners was abolished, thank goodness, and judges decided cases quickly and fairly. Catherine the Great of Russia arranged her Romanov husband's murder so she could be declared empress. She continued Peter the Great's effort of modernizing Russia and bringing in Western culture, and she restricted torture of prisoners and allowed religious toleration. Catherine the Great was also interested in increasing the territorial size of Russia, and she pushed Russia into the Caucasus and Asian regions and partitioned Poland. Maria Theresa of Austria established reforms in her nation. Her daughter Marie Antoinette married into the French royal family, and her son Joseph II, who was heir to the throne, abolished serfdom. And then when the enlightened Joseph II died, he is going to be replaced by his brother Leopold II. And Leopold comes in and he cancels a lot of Joseph's reforms because he believed, and to some extent it is true, those reforms brought a lot of turmoil throughout Austria. And then your book goes on to describe kind of the limitations of enlightened absolutism, especially when it comes to the Jewish community. You have to remember that European Jews faced discrimination. They were even forced to live in these tiny, overcrowded neighborhoods, which we call them ghettos. And you've probably heard the term ghetto before. It actually comes from this European root and actually a Jewish root, actually an Italian word, sorry. But we have this enlightened movement. It's called Haskalah, and that was an enlightened movement within the Jewish community, and it was led by Moses Mendelssohn, and he advocated for the freedom and civil rights of European Jews, and arguments for Jewish civil rights won ground in Austria under Joseph II. Catherine the Great established a region known as the Pale of Settlement that included kind of the upper, it depends on where you're looking, so it's upper part of Europe, but it included like Lithuania, Latvia, the Ukraine, parts of Poland, and some other areas. And the Russian Jews were required to live in those regions. And I think we even have a map. You guys know I love maps. But yeah, here is that Pale of Settlement where Jews were forced to settle in this area. Which it looks like a really big area, but you have to remember there are other Europeans occupying the space as well. So it's not just like, oh, all this is open to Jews, like reservations in the Americas. Like, no, this was also occupied and settled by other Europeans at the time. So just forcing them into this small containment area, if you will. And then here is the partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We'll go talk about that a little bit, but you can read more about that in your book. So let's talk about economic and demographic change. This economic change of the Atlantic world. So European food production increased with a greater level of agricultural understanding. Fencing off common land to create privately owned fields, known as the enclosure system, increased agricultural production, but limited the poor farmers' access to land. The Columbian Exchange had now established an increase in nutrition. Vitamins within the diet had increased, which improved the overall general health of Europe. Improved health throughout Europe contributed to population growth. Sugar and tea became important commodities, not only in the European diet, but also in the European markets and economy. Manufactured clothing became a major economic boost. Fashionable styles made clothes more desirable and increased sales. Mass production of clothing lowered the price, making it possible for more people to afford purchases. And Paris, France, is going to become the center for new fashions in the clothing industry. As we all know, the slave trade, a major part of the Atlantic economic system is the slave trade. Major agricultural products produced in the New World were labor-intensive, making slaves an important commodity of trade. The French economy in the Caribbean colonies also was based on the use of slave labor. Spain's colonial holdings in the New World included the opportunity for quick riches with silver production, and following the end of the 7 Years' War, Spain's holding increased at the expense of the French. If you don't know about the 7 Years' War, go back and read. It's also known as the French and Indian War here in the Americas. You can read more about that. Also, probably you can bring up maps before and after the war and kind of see what your book is talking about, how Spain's able to get more holdings because of the French. This is just an example of cottage industry. Sometimes when we talk about like manufacturing things in the home, we really don't understand what that means. So you'll notice here the spinning wheel, right, to turn this into thread, if you will. And then also, so this is just an example of all the different parts of the process of like textile manufacturing that's going on in the home. One more for you, the Atlantic economy. You've probably seen this picture before. Slaves coming out of the western part of Africa. There was gold that came out of here as well. Manufactured goods from Europe going into Africa, going into South America, and into essentially North America by way of the Caribbean. And then coming out of the Americas, we have tobacco, we have furs from the Canadian regions, silver, sugar, and of course the silver coming out, especially from South America. Also, here's another just a visual for you, total exports and total exports to the Atlantic economy. So you can see the manufactured goods. This is between almost like a 75-year span between 770 and 1774. Okay, urban life, so cities, right? The growth of urban life gave rise to new institutions that promoted public discussion of intellectual and social issues. From 1700 to 1789, the production and consumption of books grew significantly. Libraries, bookshops, and cafes gave rise to the public sphere, a space in which social, economic, and political ideas could be exchanged and debated by average citizens. Economic growth in the second half of the 18th century also created the beginnings of a consumer revolution, right? We're now making enough money that we're not just subsistence living. We're not just what we would kind of think of, you can equate it to as like living paycheck to paycheck. We now actually have a little bit of extra money that we can go buy like a cake. We can go buy a new dress. we have that more money coming in, and that develops into a consumer revolution. And that made available new foods and finished products to common people that they didn't have access to before. Standard of living has improved. The diet has improved. We now have enough money that we can buy these luxury items, if you will. I know that you probably don't think of soap as a luxury item, but technically it is. Being able to afford nice shampoos and nice things for your home, those are considered luxury items that now people in the 1700s can finally afford. And this is common people, not just people that, come from wealth and come from the aristocracy. These are everyday people. More and more of them are coming into this consumer revolution. In various ways, the establishment of the colonies throughout the New World and Americanization began to take place throughout parts of the world as well. Chocolate and potatoes quickly spread around the civilized world. Along with those products, native remedies influenced medical thoughts in Europe. Enlightened ideas were welcome to the British New World colonies. Some of the political thought was enhanced in the colonies by thinkers such as Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. Kind of our founding fathers picked up on these ideas of Rousseau and Descartes and John Locke. So mining schools were established by the Spanish in Mexico City, right, to mine, like silver, that kind of mining. Not all Europeans living in the New World were wealthy. We know this, right? A lot of people that were coming over, especially when we're talking about the New World and we're talking about the English colonists that are coming over, the most well-off, I believe, were the Puritans that settled in Massachusetts. For the most part, these people are poor that are coming over. Someone else is paying for them to come over, and then they're working for 7 years to pay off that passage payment. So, we do have a really low class that's living in the New World. Many shopkeepers, craftsmen, farmers, and plantation managers, that's going to make up the middle or the lower class. As a variety of people came together within the New World, new ethnic groups began to develop. We have mixed races of European, African, and Native American backgrounds mixed into what became the Creole society. And finally, British North America was influenced by the practical, problem-solving emphasis of the Scottish Enlightenment. Northern Enlightenment thinkers thought of Spanish American colonies as backward and superstitious relative to the British colonies of the North. And isn't that kind of funny? Like going through your American history classes growing up, before, say, you got into college, did you really talk about Spanish colonization a whole lot? You probably talked about conquistadors, but you really didn't think about, or you weren't made to think about, how conquistador influence really influenced a lot of the landscape in America, North America, specifically the United States, or what will become the United States. You have to remember, Spain had gone through from Florida all the way out to California. They had settled that entire south and southwest region before the British ever got here. But we came to think of the Spanish as being backward, and we kind of have left them out of textbooks up until, the last several decades. Now we're starting to talk more about the Spanish influence on American landscape. The Spanish monarchy took a course of enlightened despotism, striving for greater centralization and administrative efficiency. Educated Creoles in the Spanish Americas became aware of Enlightenment currents of thought, an awareness that made possible critiques of Spanish rule and aspiration to greater autonomy for Spanish colonies. And I'm just going to borrow from your book here. So at the end of the 18th century, new notions of progress and social improvement, that's going to be what drives Europeans to embark on world-changing revolutions in politics and also in industry. These revolutions, which we're going to talk about those in chapters as we come up on some more chapters, those revolutions provided the basis for modern democracy and unprecedented scientific advancement. We are going to see some critiques have seen a darker side. For them, the mastery over nature enabled by the scientific revolution and now threatened to overwhelm the Earth's fragile equilibrium, and the Enlightenment belief in the universal application of reason can lead to intolerance of other people's spiritual, cultural, and political values, which we still see that in 2022. As the era of European exploration and conquest gave way to empire building, the 18th century is going to witness this increased consolidation of global markets and bitter competition among Europeans. The 18th century Atlantic world thus tied the shores of Europe, both of the Americas, and Africa in a web of commercial and human exchange, including the horrors of slavery. The Atlantic world also maintained strong ties with trade in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. So as we move forward, we are going to skip chapter 20 that talks about the Americas and the Atlantic slave trade, because I feel like you have talked about that in detail throughout your American history classes. If you have not, please go back and read chapter 20 to familiarize yourself with that. And we are going to move on to chapter 21. And in chapter 21, we are going to talk about East Asia and some really cool things happening in East Asia that I'm very excited to introduce to you. Just don't critique my pronunciation when we get to chapter 21. But that's coming up also this first week.